When they think about time, they have only one thing that surrounds them: the present. Their lives are marked by a calendar. Their daily routine is filled with the noise of cities and digital streams. They think they know how the world works, but their knowledge is the result of centuries of progress, which they take for granted. They are confident that if they were suddenly transported back to the past, to the Middle Ages, they would easily survive. Their heads crammed with information seem to them to be a universal key. They think they could apply their knowledge of chemistry, physics, or even just hygiene to make a life for themselves. But they forget that knowledge without context and without tools is just an abstraction. Medieval people did not know many things that are known to modern people, but they had something that gave them a chance: experience. Experience of survival, experience of working the land, experience of interacting with people who live by completely different rules. And this is where the main mistake of modern people lies. The knowledge they are so proud of has no practical value without modern technology and developed infrastructure. Without these, they are simply unable to adapt to the harsh reality. Their confidence in their abilities is just an illusion created by the comfortable life that civilization has given them. Watch until the end, and you'll find out why your last 24 hours could be your last. Modern people measure time in seconds, minutes, and hours, organizing their lives with digital calendars and precise schedules. For them, it is a linear, continuous flow in which they move steadily forward, measuring progress and planning for the future. They can say to the minute when they need to be at a meeting, and they expect the same from others because being late is considered disrespectful. But in medieval England, peasants lived by a completely different clock, where such precision would have been not only impossible, but also meaningless. Their consciousness was so deeply tied to nature and its eternal cycles that they developed a kind of chronological amnesia. They did not remember exact dates or even years in the modern sense, but instead oriented themselves by key, life-important events. For example, the year was not 1348, but the year when the Black Death came, or not 1351, but the year after the Great Wind. Memory did not cling to numbers, but to vivid, often tragic images. The year of the drought, the winter when the wolves came to the village, or the year after the neighbor's barn burned down. This was not a lack of intelligence or underdevelopment, but a fundamentally different way of organizing memory and life itself, dictated by the surrounding reality. Their time was not a linear vector pointing toward an unknown future, but rather a cyclical, rotating wheel of the year. Events repeated with predictable regularity: spring plowing, sheep shearing, summer haymaking, harvest, fruit picking, autumn slaughter, and a long quiet winter, followed by planting again. Each year was basically the same as the last, and there was no practical reason to remember the exact date. What good was it to know that today was, say, the third day of the month, when the main measure of time was the rising of the sun, the position of the shadows cast by trees, and the ringing of church bells, calling people to morning, matins, or midday, sex prayers? Life flowed like a river, following the curves of the landscape and the seasons, and they simply floated along, doing the work prescribed by nature itself. A modern person, finding themselves in such an environment, would desperately try to determine what year it was, what day it was, and would receive nothing but sincere bewilderment in response. His attempts to keep a diary or plan a week ahead would seem like eccentricity or even madness. He would be unable to explain what the past was if it was not connected to a specific, tangible event that affected the entire community. And here's the most interesting part. In some communities where literacy was the preserve of clerics and lords, there was a unique tradition called the memory community. The role of history keepers was not performed by a few specially trained individuals, but rather by the collective memory of the elders, who were responsible for preserving the chronology of events important to the village. They did not write them down, but memorized them and passed them on by word of mouth around the hearth on long winter evenings. This was their unspoken but essential social function. They remembered the year the Lord granted the village a new privilege, when the mill was built, or that, in the year of the great flood, John, the blacksmith's son, was born, which means he must be about 40 now. Their knowledge was practical and served the needs of the community, resolving land disputes, confirming inheritance rights, or simply preserving the identity of the village. But this knowledge did not extend beyond their small world. And for modern people, their information, devoid of precise dates and global context, would be incoherent and meaningless. Watch this video to the end and find out how even the simplest, seemingly trivial questions about time could have fatal consequences for a person from the future. Modern people live under the illusion that basic gestures are universal and intuitively understandable. A thumbs-up sign, an affirmative nod, a confused shrug. They believe that these signals will be interpreted correctly anywhere in the world and in any era. But in medieval England, there was a whole incredibly complex language of gestures that has long since disappeared. These gestures were not just an addition or replacement for words, but carried deep social, legal, and religious meanings that were obvious to locals but completely incomprehensible to outsiders. For example, in some regions of Northumbria, there may have been a gesture known as the prayer hand. A person holding their palms together at chest level and pointing their fingers upward silently demonstrated that they came in peace and had no malicious intent. This gesture may have referred to the image of a praying saint and symbolized purity of thought. However, it was only understood by the locals, and modern people would most likely not be able to use it correctly, or worse, would simply not notice or understand it. Another striking example is the refusal gesture, which was used when a person wanted to say no firmly. This was not done by the familiar shaking of the head from side to side, but by a sharp, almost aggressive movement, raising the arm to shoulder level with a tightly clenched fist. This was an extremely important gesture because it showed not just disagreement, but a willingness to confront and defend one's position, possibly even by force. He was signaling, "My answer is no, and I'm not going to change it." A modern person who simply shakes their head in response to a request or proposal will be perceived at best as weak-willed or indecisive. At worst, they will be seen as a coward or someone who does not respect the other person, expressing their disagreement in a sluggish and unconvincing manner, which could be interpreted as an insult. What would happen if our contemporary, in an effort to be friendly, tried to shake someone's hand? This seemingly harmless and universal greeting ritual could lead to disaster. In most regions of England at that time, shaking hands, or more precisely grasping the forearm or wrist, was not a simple greeting. It was a sacred gesture, meaning that a person wanted to shake hands, that is, to enter into a binding agreement, take an oath, or confirm a contract. This gesture was used to seal the sale of livestock, the lease of land, or a promise of loyalty. And if a time traveler shook hands with a local farmer and then reneged on a non-existent deal, he could be accused of perjury and fraud, serious offenses that could cost him not only his property, but also his freedom. He would never have been able to explain that he simply wanted to say hello, because this abstract concept simply did not exist in their culture of gestures. How could he communicate if his words were incomprehensible to anyone, and his gestures could be interpreted as a threat, an oath, or an insult? Don't switch channels. The most interesting part is coming up. Modern people believe in the law, the police, and the courts. For them, these institutions are a guarantee of their safety and rights. They know that if they are wronged, they can seek protection. They are confident that justice will be restored. This belief in the legal system is the foundation of their worldview. They are accustomed to justice being a long but at least predictable process involving lawyers, evidence, and appeals. They understand that decisions are made based on laws, not personal beliefs. They can appeal a verdict they believe to be unfair, and this possibility gives them a sense of security. This system seems to him to be the only correct one. But in medieval England, there was what could be called legal nihilism. The concept of law was vague, and each feudal lord interpreted it in his own way. Laws passed by the king were difficult to reach the peasants, and their interpretation was very loose, depending on the mood of the local feudal lord. This created a system where power was above the law. Instead of a formal court, they had a communal court consisting of elders and respected people. This court did not follow the laws but was based on common sense and community morals. Its decisions were not aimed at punishment, but at restoring order and social harmony. The purpose of the court was not to punish the guilty, but to resolve conflicts that could destroy the community. For example, if someone stole bread, they were not sent to prison. Instead, he might be forced to work in the fields to make up for his mistake, or he might be expelled from the village. These measures were intended to make him understand his mistake and return to the community as a full member. Prison would have been pointless because it did not solve the problem. But no one thought this was unfair. This court had no written records, and its decisions were final and could not be appealed. The decision of the community court was the law, and no one challenged it. For them, it was the only way to survive, because conflicts within the community could lead to its collapse. The most interesting thing is that in some communities there was a so-called court of witnesses. If a person was accused of a crime, he could bring 12 witnesses who had to swear that he was innocent. If he did so, he was acquitted. But these witnesses had to be from his community, and they had to be respected people. If a modern person who has no friends or acquaintances in the village tried to use this method, no one would believe him. His witnesses are his word, and the word of a stranger carries no weight. What would happen if he tried to appeal to justice or the law? His words would be meaningless because in their world, the law is what the community court decides. And if he tried to protest, he would be taken for a madman or a heretic, which would be much worse for him. His attempts to explain what a constitution or the presumption of innocence is will be met with a wall of incomprehension. This solution seems impossible, but that is exactly what we will discuss next. Stay with us. Modern people think that hunger is when they haven't eaten for a couple of hours. For them, hunger is a temporary inconvenience that can be easily remedied by going to a cafe or a store. They don't know what real debilitating hunger is when every calorie counts. They don't understand that hunger can be not just a feeling, but a condition that lasts for months. But in medieval England, hunger was a constant companion in life. But they didn't just starve. They developed a whole survival diet that allowed them to hold out until the next harvest. This diet consisted of what we would now call animal food. It was designed to get the maximum energy from the minimum amount of food, without regard for taste or nutritional value. For example, they ate tree bark, which they boiled to make it edible, or roots that they found in the forest. They also ate dirty bread, made from grain that contained a lot of straw, husks, and other impurities. This bread was very coarse and inedible for modern humans, but for them, it was their only source of energy. Their bodies were adapted to such food, and their stomachs were adapted to digest it. What would happen if a modern person refused to eat such food? Their bodies, accustomed to soft, processed food, would simply not be able to digest it. They would begin to suffer from stomach upset, which would be very dangerous in the absence of medicine. They would try to find something more familiar, but they would not find it. How did they cope with hunger during the long winter months when food supplies ran out? They didn't just eat whatever they could find, but used unique preserves. For example, they made fish cakes consisting of dried fish mixed with flour and water. These cakes were very nutritious and could be stored for months, but their taste and smell were so disgusting that modern people would not be able to eat them. Their food was not for pleasure, but for survival. Don't switch channels. The most interesting part is coming up. For modern people, fire is a lighter or matches. They perceive fire as something ordinary that can be obtained at any moment. For them, it is simply a tool that can be used and turned off when it is no longer needed. They do not think about its significance. They are used to being able to get fire at any moment by simply pressing a button or striking a match. This simplicity makes fire seem insignificant and unworthy of special attention. They have never experienced the fear of losing fire because they know they can always get it back. This is their confidence in technology. But in medieval England, fire was not just a source of heat. It was part of the home that had to be maintained. Fire was the heart of the home, its soul, its protection. If the fire went out, the house was considered dead. It was a symbol of life and had to be protected. In some regions, there was a tradition that the fire in the hearth should never go out. This tradition was not just a habit, but part of their worldview. They believed that fire was the soul of the home, and if it went out, the home would die. They passed this tradition down from generation to generation. It was not just a practical necessity, but a religious ritual. They believed that fire protected the home from evil spirits and that it was a link between the world of the living and the world of the dead. They believed that fire was a gift from the gods. It was so deeply ingrained in their culture that they could not imagine life without this tradition. They believed that fire was a home flame that protected the house from evil spirits and was a symbol of life and prosperity. They believed that fire purified the air and gave them warmth and light. It was not just fire, but their life. They were completely dependent on it. What would happen if a modern person, unaware of this, extinguished the fire? They would not just leave the house without heat, but would violate an ancient ritual that, in their opinion, protected the entire family. Their actions would be perceived as sacrilege, as something that brings misfortune to the house. They would be considered an enemy, and he would be taken for a man who brought trouble and misfortune upon the house. He could be expelled from the village or even executed. They would consider him guilty of bringing misfortune upon them. They would not be able to understand that he simply did not know. And he won't be able to explain that he just wanted to save firewood. Because in their world, fire wasn't a resource that could be saved, but a sacred symbol that had to be protected. He'll talk about resources, and they'll think about spirits. His logic will be meaningless to them. And how did they keep the fire going when they ran out of wood? They used forgotten technologies. For example, in some regions, they made peat briquettes, consisting of peat mixed with straw and clay. These briquettes burned very slowly and gave off a lot of heat, which saved wood. But modern people don't know how to make them. And even if they did, they wouldn't be able to find the necessary materials. They would have to look for firewood in the forest, but they don't know which trees can be cut down and which cannot. How did they keep warm without knowing what heating was? They didn't just keep a fire going, they used heating stones. These stones were placed in the stove, where they heated up, and then, when they were taken out, they gave off heat. This was very effective but very dangerous because the stones could crack, which could lead to a fire. They didn't know what thermodynamics was, but they knew that stones could retain heat. Stay with us. There's more surprises ahead. Modern people dress to be comfortable, to be warm, and to look good. They perceive clothing as a means of expressing their individuality and status. They do not think about the fact that clothing is, first and foremost, protection from the environment. Their wardrobe is huge and they can change it every day. They can choose any clothes, any color, and any style. There are no restrictions except their own taste and wallet. They can wear jeans, t-shirts, suits, and it will be considered normal. They don't think about the fact that in another time this would have been impossible. For him, clothes are a way of expressing himself, a reflection of his personality and taste. He can show who he is through his clothes. He can be a rebel, a fashionista, a conservative, and all of this will be reflected in his wardrobe. His clothes are his calling card. He doesn't think about its functionality. He doesn't think that his light jacket won't protect him from the cold or that his fashionable boots won't save him from the dirt. He thinks about how he looks, not how he will survive. His clothes are his aesthetic, not his armor. But in medieval England, clothing was not just clothing, it was a second skin. It was part of their survival, their protection from the environment. Without clothing, they could not have lived a single day. It was their only shield from the harsh world. It was made from rough, natural materials such as linen and wool. These materials were durable, but not very comfortable. They were heavy, and they weren't pretty, but they were the only ones available. It protected them from the cold, rain, wind, and even wild animals. It was their only way to survive in harsh conditions. They couldn't just buy new clothes if they tore, so they wore them until they were worn out. It was their only hope. It was part of their survival. Without clothes, they couldn't work in the fields, they couldn't go into the forest, they couldn't even sleep. It was their protection, their armor, their life. They couldn't imagine life without it. But it was not just clothing, it had social and religious significance. For example, in some regions, peasants were forbidden to wear brightly colored clothes because it was a privilege of the nobility. Also, depending on the fabric from which the clothes were made, it was possible to determine which class a person belonged to. What would happen if a modern person came dressed in bright clothes? They would be taken for a madman or a spy. They would stand out from the crowd, and this could attract attention. And in medieval England, attention was dangerous. Their clothes would not be able to protect them because they were not suited to life in the Middle Ages. How did they make clothes? They didn't buy them in stores, they made them themselves. They spun wool, wove fabric, and sewed clothes. It was very labor-intensive, and they didn't have time for fashion. Their clothes were simple but very durable. What would he do if his clothes tore and he had no needle or thread to repair them? His clothes, made of synthetic materials, would be impossible to repair, and he would be left without protection from the cold and moisture. Keep watching to understand the whole point. Modern people cannot imagine life without a bathroom and running water. For them, it is so basic that they do not even think about its existence. Imagine that you cannot simply turn on the tap to wash your hands or drink water. This idea seems absurd and completely unrealistic for our time. They are used to clean water always being available from the tap, and hygiene issues being resolved in a matter of minutes. They do not understand that this cleanliness is the result of centuries of civilization and an entire water purification system. For them, hygiene is not a luxury, but a necessary part of life that they do not even need to think about. This habit is so deeply ingrained in his mind that he cannot give it up. But in medieval England, things were very different. Hygiene was not just absent, it was practically non-existent. Cleanliness was not a value, and people did not understand why it was important. Their world was a world of dirt and smells, and they saw nothing wrong with that. Running water was only available in some cities, and even then, not in all homes, while villagers relied on wells and rivers. These water sources were dirty because waste was dumped into them, and no one thought that this could lead to disease. They drank this water, washed their clothes in it, and bathed in it without thinking about the consequences. Toilets were either in the street or non-existent. This meant that people relieved themselves wherever they could, creating ideal conditions for the spread of infection. It was a world where dirt was the norm and cleanliness was the exception. People relieved themselves in the streets, in ditches, or in special pits. These pits were full of sewage and were breeding grounds for disease. It was so commonplace that no one even paid attention to it, and it was part of their everyday life. And no one considered it bad because it was part of their everyday life. They did not know what germs and bacteria were, and they did not understand that dirt was a source of disease. Their world was so far removed from ours that we cannot even imagine it. What would happen if a modern person, accustomed to clean water and hygiene, could not adapt to this? Their body, accustomed to sterile conditions, would not be able to cope. They would be constantly ill, and their body would be unable to fight off infections. It would be hell for them. They would not be able to drink dirty water because their bodies are not used to it. This water would be poison to them, and they would suffer from stomach disorders, which would be very dangerous in the absence of medicine. They would try to find clean water but would not find it, and this would lead to their death. He will suffer from infections, which will be very dangerous in the absence of medicine. Even a simple wound or scratch could be fatal for him. His body will not be able to fight off bacteria, and he will die of blood poisoning. He will not be able to explain what germs or bacteria are, and his attempts to drink only clean water will be perceived as strange and incomprehensible. People will not understand why he is behaving this way and will consider him crazy or a heretic, which will be even worse for him. His words will fall on deaf ears. And what about night soil? In some cities, such as York, there was something called night soil that was dumped directly onto the streets. It was so commonplace that no one even paid attention to it. This soil was a source of disease, and it was everywhere. And a modern person who doesn't know about this could get caught in the night rain. He wouldn't be able to avoid it because it was part of their lives. He wouldn't be able to protect himself from it because he doesn't have an umbrella or a raincoat, and this would result in him being dirty and wet. He cannot avoid it because it was part of their lives. He cannot explain that it is bad because they will not understand him. His body, accustomed to cleanliness, will begin to rebel. He will begin to suffer from infections, which in the absence of medicine will be very dangerous. And his body, accustomed to cleanliness, will begin to rebel. His immune system, which is used to being protected from infections, will not be able to cope. He will begin to suffer from infections, which will be very dangerous in the absence of medicine. He will begin to suffer from infections that will be very dangerous in the absence of medicine. He will die of blood poisoning or some disease that can be treated in a couple of days in the modern world. They will think that he brought misfortune upon them, and they will want to get rid of him. How did they survive hunger without knowing what agricultural technology was? Now you will find out. Modern people buy food in stores. For them, food is a commodity that they receive ready-made, without thinking about how it was produced. They don't see how the grain grew, how it was harvested, or how it was ground. In their world, food just appears on the shelves. They don't know how to grow it. For them, agriculture is something distant and abstract, something that other people do. They don't understand that in order to survive, you need to know how to plant a seed, how to care for a plant, and how to harvest it. This knowledge is like an ancient, forgotten language to them. He doesn't know how to plow the land, how to sow, how to reap. He has never held a plow in his hands, never felt the weight of a harrow, never worked with a sickle. His hands are not used to such labor, and his body is not used to such exertion. He doesn't know that each tool requires a special approach, and that without the right skills, it is useless. He does not know how to care for animals, how to milk a cow, how to shear a sheep. He does not know that animals are not just food, but part of the family that requires care and attention. He does not understand that his own survival depends on his ability to care for them. He has never milked a cow and doesn't even know which side to approach it from. But in medieval England, all of this was the basis of life. Without these skills, a person would be useless to the community and unable to feed himself. He would be like a fish thrown ashore, completely helpless. He would not know how to survive even a single day. A man who could not work the land was doomed. He would not be able to get food, and without food, he would simply starve to death. He would be an outcast because in their world, everyone had to contribute to the community. He would be a nobody with no land, no food, and no future. In medieval England, there were very complex agricultural techniques that were passed down from generation to generation. This knowledge was not just advice, but real instructions that helped people survive. They knew when to sow, when to reap, and when to rest. They were masters of their craft. This knowledge was secret and was not written down. It was passed down by word of mouth from father to son. It was knowledge that could not be bought, only earned. It was sacred, and no one could simply obtain it. For example, in some regions, there was a tradition of a sowing ritual. Before sowing, the farmer had to perform a certain ritual to appease the earth. He had to say special words and make a sacrifice so that the earth would be favorable to him. This was not just a ritual, but part of their faith. And if he did not do this, it was believed that the harvest would be poor. They believed that if they did not appease the earth, it would not bear fruit. And this harvest was their only source of food for the entire winter. If the harvest was poor, the whole village would starve. What would happen if a modern person who didn't know about this tried to sow? He wouldn't understand that for them, it wasn't just work, but a sacred ritual. He wouldn't know what to do, and his actions would seem silly to them. He would just throw the seeds into the ground without performing the ritual, and that would be a bad sign for them. His attempts would be considered a bad omen for the community. They would think that he had brought misfortune upon them, that he would bring them famine. They would fear him and shun him. He would not be a human being to them, but a curse. He may be expelled from the village or even executed. They will believe that he is to blame for the poor harvest. For modern people, illness is a temporary inconvenience. They are used to the idea that there is a pill, an injection, or a doctor for every ailment. They are not afraid of dying from the flu or a common cold because they know that modern medicine can handle it. They have access to information and know about the existence of antibiotics and vaccines. This knowledge gives them a sense of security. But in medieval England, illness was a punishment from God, and doctors were street healers. People believed that illnesses were sent as punishment for sins, and the only thing one could do was pray and ask for forgiveness. Doctors were not scientists, but rather priests or shamans who tried to drive evil spirits out of people. They did not engage in treatment, but rather in religious rituals. They had no education, and their methods of treatment were very strange. They did not know what anatomy was and did not understand how the human body worked. Their knowledge was based on superstitions and old beliefs, not on science. They believed that disease could be expelled from the body. For example, they might perform bloodletting, believing that this would help expel evil forces from the body. They would make incisions in the skin to release bad blood, which they believed was the cause of disease. This method was very dangerous and often led to death, but they believed it was the only way to save a person. They did not know about the existence of infections, and their methods often only worsened the patient's condition. What would happen if a modern person who fell ill could not be cured? They would try to explain that they need antibiotics, but no one would understand them. They would talk about viruses and bacteria, but their words would sound like gibberish. Their attempts to explain that they need help would be perceived as madness. Their words would be meaningless. He would not be able to explain that he needs medicine because these concepts simply did not exist. He would try to find medicine, but he would not find it. And his body, accustomed to modern medicine, will be very vulnerable. His immune system, which is used to being protected by drugs, will not be able to cope. He will die from the simplest of illnesses, which in the modern world can be treated in a couple of days. He will suffer from infections that were commonplace in their world. And what about the street healers? They were unlicensed and their medicines were very dangerous. They did not know which herbs were poisonous and which were not. They mixed different herbs and roots, and their medicines could be deadly. They did not understand how these herbs interacted with each other, and their medicines were pure lottery. For example, they might sell magic powders that were made from poisonous herbs. These powders, in their opinion, were supposed to drive evil spirits out of a person, but in reality, they were poisonous and could kill a person. They didn't understand dosage, and their medicines were deadly. And modern people who don't know about this can get poisoned. They will think they are getting help, but in fact, they will be taking poison. They will not be able to explain that it is poison because they will not understand. Their attempts to warn others will be perceived as attempts to harm them. The answer to this question is much more interesting than it seems. Stay tuned. Modern man lives in a world where all people are equal before the law. He can communicate with anyone, regardless of their social status. He is not afraid to look into the eyes of a person who occupies a higher position because he knows that he has the same rights. This sense of equality is the basis of their worldview, the foundation for building an open and just society. In this world, they can express their opinions without fear of consequences and without thinking about who they are talking to. But in medieval England, there were unwritten, taboo laws. Society was strictly divided into classes: nobility, clergy, and peasants. Each person had their place in society from which they could not escape. Their place in society was predetermined at birth, and they could not change it. It was not just a rule, but a law. This rigid hierarchy permeated all aspects of life, from everyday trifles to the most important decisions, and left no room for personal freedom. For example, peasants were forbidden to look nobles in the eye. This was considered disrespectful and could be punished. It was not just a rule, but a law that no one dared to break. They believed that if a peasant looked a nobleman in the eye, he was showing pride, and pride was a sin. This was so deeply ingrained in their culture that they couldn't imagine life without this rule. What would happen if a modern person who didn't know about this tried to look a nobleman in the eye? He could be accused of rebellion and punished. He wouldn't understand why he was being punished because in his world it wasn't a crime. His attempts to explain that he didn't mean to offend anyone would fall on deaf ears. And he would not be able to explain that he just wanted to look, because that concept simply did not exist. He would try to explain that he did not want to offend anyone, but his words would mean nothing. He would be considered a rebel who wants to disrupt the order. He would not be able to understand that his action was perceived as a threat. And as for the social ladder, it didn't exist. A peasant was a peasant, and he couldn't become a nobleman. His place in society was predetermined at birth, and he couldn't change it. It wasn't just a rule, it was a law that no one dared to break. It was part of their lives, and they could not imagine a different reality where a person could climb the social ladder. The system was designed to suppress any ambitions and aspirations for change, and any deviation from the established order was perceived as a threat to stability. And modern people who are unaware of this may try to break these rules. They will try to socialize with the nobility and get jobs that do not correspond to their status. They will think that they can change their destiny, but they are mistaken. They will try to prove that they are worthy of more, but their words will fall on deaf ears. And they will simply be excluded from society. They will be considered an outcast and will not be able to find their place. They will be alone, without friends, without family, without a future. They will not be able to understand that their attempts to change their fate were perceived as a threat to the whole society. Don't switch channels. The most interesting part is coming up. Thus, if a modern person found themselves in the Middle Ages, a very sad fate would await them. Their knowledge of which they are so proud would be useless without context and without tools. They would not be able to adapt to their way of life, their habits, their laws. He would not be able to find a common language. He would not be able to find food. He would not be able to protect himself from disease. His body, accustomed to comfort, would not be able to withstand the harsh conditions. He would not be able to understand social hierarchy or the law of the jungle. He would be a stranger whom no one would understand. His life, which seems so stable to him, would be destroyed in 24 hours. And he would realize that his knowledge without practical experience is nothing but empty words. What do you think about this part of the story? What people or times would you like to learn about in the next episode? If you enjoyed this video, be sure to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss any new stories.